The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pine Ridge Reservation as 16-year-old Ayanna Crowfeather walked the familiar dirt path toward the old creek. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind from the night before. Stories of their ancestors who had walked these same lands generations ago. The weight of family expectations pressed down on her shoulders like the heavy wool blanket she wrapped around herself against the early autumn chill. Ayanna had always been different from other girls her age. While they gathered in groups, giggling about boys and planning their futures beyond the reservation boundaries, she found comfort in solitude. The creek had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the crushing reality of life on Pine Ridge. Poverty was a constant companion here, with boarded-up houses dotting the landscape like broken teeth in an old man's smile. Her family's trailer sat on a small plot of land inherited from her great-grandfather. The metal siding had long since faded from white to a dull gray, and the front steps creaked ominously under even the slightest weight. Inside, 3 generations lived in cramped quarters. Her mother Sarah worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and the lights on. Her father had left when Ayanna was 12, unable to cope with the responsibilities and the bottle that had become his closest friend. The responsibility of helping care for her 2 younger brothers, Tommy and Jake, had fallen largely on Ayanna's shoulders. At 8 and 10 years old, they looked up to their big sister with a mixture of admiration and need that sometimes felt overwhelming. Tommy had been born with a learning disability that made school challenging, while Jake struggled with asthma that flared up whenever the stress in their household became too intense. Walking toward the creek that morning, Ayanna carried more than just her grandmother's old fishing pole. She carried the weight of being the stable presence in her brothers' lives, the translator between her traditional grandmother, who spoke mostly Lakota, and the outside world that demanded English, and the keeper of dreams that seemed impossible in their current circumstances. Her grandmother, Winona, was a medicine woman respected throughout the community. She had taught Ayanna the old ways, the healing properties of plants, and the importance of maintaining their cultural traditions. But Winona was 83 now, and her health was declining. The stories she told seemed more urgent lately, as if she was trying to pass down generations of wisdom before time ran out. The creek wound its way through a small canyon about 2 miles from their home. It was here that Ayanna felt most connected to her heritage. The water sang ancient songs as it bubbled over smooth stones, worn down by countless years of flowing water. Cottonwood trees lined the banks, their leaves rustling with secrets only the wind could understand. As she settled onto her favorite spot, a flat rock that jutted out over the deepest part of the creek, Ayanna allowed herself to dream. She imagined a future where she could attend college, maybe study environmental science or social work. She wanted to help her community, to find ways to bring hope back to a place that had seen too much struggle. The reservation had a suicide rate among the highest in the nation, particularly among young people her age. 3 of her classmates had taken their own lives in the past 2 years. The funerals had been devastating, not just for the families involved, but for the entire community. Each loss rippled outward, touching everyone who remained. Ayanna understood the despair that led to such desperate choices. She had felt it herself during the darkest moments, when the walls of their trailer felt like they were closing in, when her mother came home exhausted from her cleaning job at the casino, when her grandmother's health took another turn for the worse. The feeling was like drowning in slow motion, where each day brought the water level a little higher. But she had the creek, she had the stories her grandmother told, she had the sunrise that painted the Badlands in brilliant oranges and purples every morning. She had her brother's laughter when they played with the stray dog that had adopted their family. These things kept her anchored when the current of despair threatened to sweep her away. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. The air carried an unusual tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm when even the birds fall silent. Ayanna couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming, though she had no idea what form it would take. Her fishing line disappeared beneath the surface of the water, and she let her mind wander to the college brochures hidden beneath her mattress. She had requested them secretly, using the computer at school to fill out forms for information about scholarship programs specifically designed for Native American students. The photographs of campus quads and smiling students seemed to exist in a different universe from her daily reality. The sun climbed higher, warming her face and making the water sparkle like scattered diamonds. A red-winged blackbird called from the cattails on the opposite bank, answered by its mate somewhere in the willows. These small moments of beauty were what sustained her, proof that there was still magic in the world despite all the hardship. A gentle tug on her fishing line brought her attention back to the present. She had caught a small trout, its silver sides flashing in the sunlight as she carefully removed the hook and released it back into the creek. Her grandmother had taught her to take only what was needed and to always give thanks for what the water provided. As the morning wore on, Ayanna found herself thinking about her friend Maria, who had left the reservation the previous year to attend a university in Colorado. The letters Maria sent were filled with descriptions of a world Ayanna could barely imagine: libraries that stayed open all night, professors who encouraged questions, students from dozens of different countries sharing ideas and dreams. But Maria's letters also spoke of loneliness, a feeling caught between two worlds. She wrote about missing the smell of sage, the sound of her grandmother's voice, the way the sky seemed bigger on the reservation than anywhere else. It was a reminder that leaving came with its own kind of pain, a severing of roots that had grown deep in this ancient soil. The creek continued its eternal journey toward the White River, carrying with it leaves, small fish, and the dreams of a young girl who sat on its banks wondering what the future might hold. Ayanna had no way of knowing that in just a few hours her life would take a dramatic turn that would test everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. Her cell phone, an ancient device with a cracked screen that her mother had managed to afford through a government assistance program, buzzed with a text message from her friend Jenny. There was going to be a party that weekend at the old abandoned house near the highway. Jenny wanted to know if Ayanna would come. Parties on the reservation were complicated affairs. They often involved alcohol, sometimes drugs, and frequently ended with someone getting hurt or arrested. But they were also one of the few social outlets available to young people who had limited options for entertainment. Ayanna had attended a few in the past, always staying on the periphery, always making sure she could get home safely. She stared at the message for a long time before typing back that she would think about it. The truth was, she was tired of thinking, tired of being responsible, tired of carrying everyone else's problems along with her own. Maybe it would be good to forget about everything for one night, to be a normal teenager without the weight of the world on her shoulders. But even as she considered it, she could hear her grandmother's voice warning about the dangers of trying to escape pain through temporary means. Winona had seen too many young people in their community fall into cycles of addiction and self-destruction. She preached about facing difficulties with courage and seeking strength through traditional practices and community support. The sun reached its peak, and Ayanna realized she had been at the creek for nearly 4 hours. Her mother would be getting ready for her afternoon shift at the tribal offices, and her brothers would need lunch. Responsibility called, as it always did, pulling her back from her peaceful refuge into the chaos of daily survival. She packed up her fishing gear and began the walk home, following the familiar path that wound through stands of pine and over small hills dotted with prairie grass. The landscape here was harsh but beautiful, shaped by wind and weather into something both unforgiving and magnificent. As she crested the hill that offered a view of their trailer, Ayanna could see smoke rising from the chimney. Her grandmother was probably preparing a traditional meal, something that would stretch to feed everyone despite their limited resources. The old woman had a gift for making much from little, whether it was food, stories, or hope. Her youngest brother Jake met her at the door, his face flushed with excitement about something he had built with an old set of blocks. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, Ayanna felt her spirits lift. This was why she stayed. This was why she endured. Her brothers needed her, and in many ways, she needed them too. The afternoon passed in its usual rhythm of household chores, homework supervision, and quiet conversations with her grandmother about plants and healing and the old ways that were slowly being forgotten. But underneath the routine, that feeling of impending change continued to grow, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. That evening, as her family settled in for the night, Ayanna lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the trailer's siding. She thought about Maria's letters, about the college brochures under her mattress, about the party invitation she still hadn't answered. She thought about the creek and the trout she had released, wondering if it was still swimming in those same waters, or if it had already moved on to explore new territories. Change was coming. She could feel it in the restlessness that kept her awake, in the way her grandmother had been looking at her lately with eyes that seemed to see into the future, in the dreams that had been visiting her sleep with increasing frequency. Dreams of flying over vast landscapes, of walking through doors that led to rooms she had never seen, of voices calling her name from places she had never been. But on this night, as she finally drifted off to sleep, Ayanna had no idea that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would alter the course of her life forever. She couldn't have imagined that a routine trip to town would lead to a moment of crisis that would test every ounce of strength and courage she possessed. The reservation slept under a blanket of stars, and somewhere in the darkness, fate was already setting the stage for a drama that would unfold beside a lonely stretch of highway, involving a desperate young woman and a stranger whose quick thinking and compassionate heart would prove that heroes come in many forms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and new possibilities. But tonight, Ayanna Crowfeather was simply a 16-year-old girl holding on to hope in a world that often seemed designed to take it away, preparing unknowingly for a test that would reveal just how strong the human spirit could be when pushed to its absolute limits. The next morning brought a crisis that would change everything. Ayanna woke to the sound of her grandmother's labored breathing and her mother's frantic voice on the phone with the tribal health clinic. Winona had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack during the night, and the nearest hospital with cardiac facilities was 40 miles away in Rapid City. Sarah Crowfeather's hands shook as she gathered her mother's medications and identification papers. The old pickup truck they relied on had been making concerning noises for weeks, and this was exactly the wrong time for mechanical problems. But there was no choice. They had to get Winona to help immediately. Tommy and Jake stood in the doorway of their grandmother's small bedroom, eyes wide with fear. They had never seen the strong woman who told them stories and made them laugh, reduced to this fragile figure struggling for each breath. Ayanna knelt beside the bed and took her grandmother's weathered hand in hers. Winona's eyes opened, focusing on her granddaughter's face with effort. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but her words in Lakota were clear. She was telling Ayanna to be brave, to remember the stories, to take care of the family. The weight of these final instructions settled around Ayanna's shoulders like a heavy shawl. The drive to Rapid City was a nightmare of mechanical sounds and prayers. The truck's engine coughed and wheezed almost as badly as Winona, who lay unconscious in the back seat with her head in Ayanna's lap. Sarah drove with the intensity of someone trying to outrun death itself, pushing the aging vehicle beyond its limits. They made it to the hospital, but barely. Steam poured from under the hood as they pulled into the emergency entrance, and the engine gave one final shudder before dying completely. Paramedics rushed Winona into the building while the Crowfeather family stood beside their broken-down truck, stranded 40 miles from home with no way to get back. The next few hours passed in a blur of waiting rooms, medical consultations, and mounting anxiety. Winona was stable but would need surgery and several days of recovery. The doctor, a kind woman who spoke gently about blocked arteries and surgical procedures, explained that the next 24 hours would be critical. Sarah arranged to stay at the hospital, sleeping in a chair beside her mother's bed. Someone needed to get the boys back home for school, and their neighbor, Mrs. Dr. Abnikatos, Red Cloud, had offered to watch them. But the truck was beyond their ability to fix, and towing it back to the reservation would cost money they didn't have. This was when Ayanna made the decision that would lead her to the highway encounter that would change her life. She volunteered to hitchhike back to Pine Ridge with her brothers, a journey that would require them to catch rides along a route known for its isolation and unpredictability. Sarah was reluctant to let her teenage daughter take on such responsibility, but options were limited. Ayanna had hitchhiked before, though never with her younger brothers in tow. She promised to be careful, to only accept rides from people who seemed safe, and to call as soon as they made it home. The first ride came easily enough. A tribal member who worked at the hospital recognized them and offered to take them as far as the reservation boundary. But from there, they found themselves standing beside Highway 18 in the late afternoon, watching the sun sink lower in the western sky as traffic became increasingly sparse. Tommy was getting tired and cranky, and Jake's asthma was acting up from the stress of the day. Ayanna began to worry that they might be stranded out here as darkness fell. This stretch of highway was notorious for accidents, drunk drivers, and worse. Stories circulated through the reservation about young people who had disappeared along these roads, their fates unknown. Several vehicles passed without stopping. Ayanna tried to look as harmless and desperate as possible, holding up a handmade sign that simply said Pine Ridge in her neatest handwriting. A few drivers slowed down as if considering stopping, but then sped up again when they saw 3 Native American youth beside the road. This was the reality of life for people from the reservation. Prejudice was a constant companion, sometimes subtle and sometimes blatant, but always present. Ayanna had grown up understanding that many people viewed them with suspicion, fear, or outright hatred, based on nothing more than their appearance and where they came from. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Ayanna began to consider their options. There was an abandoned gas station about a mile back where they might be able to take shelter for the night. She had some money in her pocket, enough maybe to buy snacks from the vending machine if it was still working. But just as she was about to suggest they start walking back toward the gas station, a pickup truck appeared in the distance. It was moving slowly, as if the driver was actually considering stopping. Ayanna felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Getting a ride was what they needed, but accepting help from strangers always carried risks. The truck pulled over about 50 feet ahead of them, and Ayanna could see it was a working ranch vehicle, dusty and practical, with hay bales in the back. The driver appeared to be a middle-aged white man, alone in the cab. He sat there for a moment, apparently thinking things over, before getting out and walking toward them. Jack Morrison had been ranching in South Dakota for 32 years, and he had driven this stretch of highway thousands of times. He knew the reservation, knew the struggles its people faced, and knew the dangers of being stranded out here after dark. When he saw the three young people beside the road, something in their body language told him this wasn't a casual request for a ride. Jack was a man shaped by the harsh realities of ranch life. He stood just over 6 feet tall, with weathered hands that spoke of decades spent working with cattle and fixing equipment. His face was lined from years in the sun and wind, but his eyes held a kindness that had been tested by life's challenges and remained intact. He had grown up on this same ranch, inheriting it from his father, who had built it from nothing during the Great Depression. The land was unforgiving, the work was endless, and the profits were often slim. But it was his life, and he understood the value of helping neighbors when they were in trouble. Jack had limited interaction with people from Pine Ridge, but what he knew suggested they faced challenges that would break many people: poverty, unemployment, health problems, and social issues that seemed impossible to solve. He had heard the statistics about suicide rates and addiction, and he had seen the effects of generational trauma in the faces of the few reservation residents he had encountered over the years. When he approached Ayanna and her brothers, Jack could see the exhaustion and worry in the teenage girl's face. She was trying to project confidence and capability, but underneath he recognized the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for her age. The two boys stood close to their sister, clearly depending on her protection and guidance. Ayanna stepped forward as the rancher approached, placing herself between her brothers and this stranger. Her grandmother had taught her to trust her instincts about people, and something about this man's careful, non-threatening approach suggested he might be safe. But she remained wary. Jack introduced himself simply, explaining that he had a ranch about 20 miles west of Pine Ridge and was heading in that direction. He asked if they needed a ride, and when Ayanna explained their situation with their grandmother's medical emergency and their broken-down truck, he nodded with understanding. The decision to accept the ride was not easy. Ayanna had heard too many stories about young Native women who had disappeared, about the violence that could erupt when vulnerable people trusted the wrong strangers. But Jake was wheezing more frequently, and the temperature was dropping as the sun set. They needed to get home. She asked Jack if he could show her some identification, explaining apologetically that she had to be careful. He understood completely and showed her his driver's license and a business card from his ranch. He also suggested that she could call someone to let them know she was getting a ride with him, providing his license plate number for safety. This consideration for their security helped convince Ayanna that Jack might be trustworthy. She called Mrs. Trefferty, Red Cloud, and gave her the information, explaining that they had found a ride and would be home soon. Then she helped her brothers into the back seat of the extended cab pickup, making sure they were securely buckled in. The ride started quietly, with Jack focusing on the road and Ayanna watching the landscape pass outside the window. But as they drove, something unexpected happened. Jake, who was usually shy around strangers, began asking Jack questions about the ranch animals they occasionally saw in passing fields. Jack found himself drawn into conversation with the curious 8-year-old, explaining about cattle breeds and the challenges of ranching in this climate. Tommy joined in with his own questions, and gradually even Ayanna found herself relaxing enough to participate in the discussion. There was something calming about Jack's presence. He spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his life solving practical problems and taking care of living things. He didn't ask probing questions about their situation, didn't offer unwanted advice, and didn't make them feel like objects of pity or charity. As they approached the reservation boundary, Jack asked for specific directions to their home. The roads here were unmarked and confusing to outsiders, winding between trailers and small houses in patterns that made sense only to people who had grown up navigating them. Ayanna guided him through the turns, noting how he drove carefully to avoid the worst potholes and respected the speed limits that many outsiders ignored. When they reached the Crowfeather trailer, Mrs. Red Cloud was waiting on the front steps, relief evident on her face when she saw the children emerge safely from the truck. Jack helped carry their few belongings to the door, politely declining an invitation to come inside for coffee. But before he left, something happened that would prove crucial to the events that were about to unfold. Jake had another asthma attack, more severe than the earlier ones, triggered by the stress and exertion of the day. His breathing became labored and frightening, and his rescue inhaler seemed to provide little relief. Mrs. Red Cloud was experienced with Jake's condition, but this attack was worse than usual. The nearest medical facility was back in town, and without transportation, getting him help quickly would be nearly impossible. The tribal ambulance service was often overwhelmed and slow to respond to non-emergency calls. Jack saw the crisis developing and made an immediate decision. He offered to drive Jake to the clinic, understanding that time was critical when dealing with respiratory emergencies. Ayanna climbed into the truck with her brother, grateful beyond words for this stranger's continued help. The drive to the clinic gave Jack deeper insight into the challenges facing this family. He learned about Ayanna's responsibilities as the oldest child, about their grandmother's role as the family's spiritual center, about the economic struggles that made every crisis exponentially more difficult to handle. At the clinic, Jack waited while medical staff treated Jake's breathing problems. He found himself thinking about the resilience required to live with such uncertainty, such limited resources, such constant pressure. The teenage girl beside him in the waiting room was carrying responsibilities that would overwhelm many adults. When Jake was finally stable and ready to go home, it was nearly midnight. Jack drove them back to the trailer, where Mrs. Red Cloud and Tommy were anxiously waiting. This time, when offered coffee, he accepted, sensing that the gesture of sharing a meal was important to these people who had so little to share. The conversation that followed over coffee and leftover fry bread would plant seeds that would grow into something life-changing. Jack learned about Ayanna's dreams of college, her academic achievements despite difficult circumstances, and her torn feelings about leaving her family to pursue an education. Mrs. Red Cloud spoke about the traditional ways of the Lakota people, about the importance of education balanced with cultural preservation, and about the tragic loss of young people who saw no future for themselves on the reservation. She talked about the need for role models, for success stories that could inspire others to keep trying. Jack found himself moved by these conversations in ways he hadn't expected. His own life had been shaped by hard work and determination, but he had always had advantages these people lacked. He had inherited land and opportunity, had grown up with expectations of success rather than predictions of failure. As he finally prepared to leave, Jack did something that surprised even himself. He gave Ayanna his business card and told her to call him if her family ever needed help getting to medical appointments or dealing with other transportation emergencies. It was a simple offer, but one that would soon prove to be a lifeline. The drive back to his ranch gave Jack time to process what he had experienced. The poverty and struggle were heartbreaking, but what had impressed him most was the strength and dignity of the people he had met. Ayanna, in particular, had shown a maturity and sense of responsibility that was remarkable for someone her age. He thought about his own daughter, away at college and blessed with opportunities that she sometimes took for granted. The contrast with Ayanna's situation was stark, and it made him appreciate both his daughter's good fortune and this young woman's extraordinary resilience. By the time he reached his ranch, Jack Morrison had made a decision that would change multiple lives. He was going to find a way to help Ayanna Crowfeather achieve her dreams, not out of pity or guilt, but out of recognition of her potential and respect for her courage. The specifics of how he could help were unclear, but the determination was solid. Neither Jack nor Ayanna could have predicted that this chance encounter would evolve into something that would challenge both of their assumptions about race, class, opportunity, and the power of human connection to bridge seemingly impossible divides. The seeds of change had been planted, and they would soon grow in ways that no one could have anticipated. 3 weeks after the highway encounter, Ayanna stood at another crossroads, though this one was metaphorical rather than literal. Her grandmother had survived the surgery and was slowly recovering, but the medical bills were mounting to impossible heights. The family's financial situation, already precarious, had become truly desperate. Sarah Crowfeather had been forced to take unpaid leave from one of her jobs to care for Winona during her recovery. Cutting their household income in half just when expenses were highest, the trailer's heating system had chosen this worst possible moment to break down completely, and winter was approaching with its usual harsh indifference to human suffering. Ayanna found herself considering options she had never wanted to face. The party invitation from Jenny had evolved into something more serious, an introduction to people who claimed they could provide easy money for simple tasks. The details were vague, but Ayanna understood enough to know that these opportunities came with risks that could destroy any chance of a legitimate future. The college brochures under her mattress had become painful reminders of dreams that seemed increasingly impossible. Even with scholarships, there would be expenses her family couldn't meet. More importantly, how could she justify leaving when her family was struggling so desperately to survive? It was during this period of mounting pressure and narrowing options that Jack Morrison's business card became a symbol of possibility. Ayanna had looked at it dozens of times, running her fingers over the simple text that read, Morrison Ranch Jack Morrison, owner, followed by a phone number. She had memorized every detail but hadn't found the courage to use it. The decision to finally call came on a particularly difficult day. Jake had missed school because of another asthma attack, this one brought on by the cold air in the trailer since the heating system failed. Tommy had come home with a black eye from fighting with classmates who had made cruel jokes about their family's poverty. And Sarah had received notice that their electricity would be shut off if payment wasn't made within 48 hours. Sitting in her car in the school parking lot after classes, Ayanna stared at Jack's business card and realized she had run out of alternatives. Her pride fought against the necessity of asking for help, but her family's needs were more important than her personal discomfort. When she finally dialed the number, her hands were shaking. She hadn't planned what to say and found herself stumbling through an explanation of their situation, apologizing for bothering him, and trying to minimize the severity of their problems, even as she asked for help. Jack's response was immediate and practical. He didn't ask probing questions about how they had gotten into such financial straits, didn't lecture about poor decision-making, and didn't make her feel like a charity case. Instead, he asked what needed to be done immediately and how he could help make it happen. Within 2 hours, Jack arrived at the trailer with a heating contractor and an electrician. He had also stopped at the grocery store, filling his truck with enough food supplies to last the family through the immediate crisis. When Ayanna tried to thank him and ask how they could repay such generosity, he brushed off her concerns with a simple statement that neighbors help neighbors. But Jack's assistance went far beyond emergency aid. As he watched the repair work being done and observed the family's living conditions more closely, he began to understand the systemic nature of their challenges. This wasn't a temporary setback that could be fixed with a one-time intervention. This was generational poverty, complicated by limited opportunities and institutional barriers that made breaking free extremely difficult. Over the following weeks, Jack found reasons to check on the family regularly. Sometimes he brought supplies that he claimed were excess from his ranch operations. Other times he offered transportation for medical appointments or grocery shopping. Each visit gave him deeper insight into their daily struggles and Ayanna's remarkable efforts to hold everything together. The relationship that developed was complex and sometimes uncomfortable for both parties. Jack was acutely aware of the racial and economic divides that separated their worlds, and he worried about whether his help was genuinely beneficial or simply made him feel better about systemic inequalities he couldn't change. Ayanna struggled with accepting assistance while maintaining her family's dignity and independence, but something genuine was growing between them, a mutual respect based on recognition of each other's character rather than circumstances. Jack admired Ayanna's intelligence, determination, and selfless dedication to her family. Ayanna respected Jack's practical wisdom, his lack of judgment, and his consistent follow-through on promises made. The breakthrough came during one of their conversations about Ayanna's educational goals. Jack had been asking about her college applications and scholarship opportunities, trying to understand the barriers she faced. As she explained the complex web of financial, practical, and emotional obstacles, he realized that conventional solutions wouldn't work for unconventional problems. Jack's proposal was audacious and unprecedented. He offered to provide Ayanna with a full scholarship to any college she could get accepted to, covering not just tuition but also living expenses, books, and emergency support for her family while she was away. In exchange, he asked only that she maintain good grades and agree to return to the area after graduation to use her education in service to her community. The offer was overwhelming and initially met with suspicion. Ayanna had learned to be wary of arrangements that seemed too good to be true, especially when they involved white benefactors making promises to Native American families. History was full of such arrangements that had ended badly for Indigenous people. Jack understood her hesitation and insisted on involving other people in structuring the agreement. He worked with lawyers, tribal education officials, and community leaders to create a formal scholarship foundation that would be transparent and accountable. The arrangement would be legally binding and professionally managed, removing personal obligations and potential conflicts from the relationship. The process of setting up the scholarship fund opened conversations between Jack and tribal leaders that neither side had anticipated. Jack learned about the historical context of Native American education, the legacy of boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man, and the ongoing challenges of balancing cultural preservation with preparation for success in mainstream American society. Tribal education officials, initially skeptical of another white rancher offering to help their young people, gradually came to appreciate Jack's genuine commitment to empowering rather than assimilating. His insistence on cultural sensitivity, community input, and long-term sustainability impressed even the most cautious observers. For Ayanna, the scholarship offer represented both incredible opportunity and terrifying responsibility. Accepting meant leaving her family during a time when they still needed her support. It meant entering a world where she would be one of very few Native American students, facing isolation and cultural challenges she could barely imagine. But it also meant the possibility of returning with knowledge and credentials that could make a real difference for her community. She could become a teacher, a social worker, a health professional, or pursue any number of careers that would allow her to address the problems she had witnessed firsthand throughout her life. The decision-making process involved the entire family and extended community. Winona, despite her slow recovery, insisted on participating in every discussion. Her perspective as an elder carried special weight, and her eventual endorsement of the plan helped convince skeptics that this opportunity could be accepted without betraying cultural values. Sarah was torn between pride in her daughter's achievements and fear of losing the stability Ayanna provided to their household. The practical questions were daunting. Who would help with the boys when they were sick? Who would translate for Winona during medical appointments? Who would provide the emotional support that held their small family together? These concerns led to another innovation in Jack's approach. Rather than simply sending Ayanna away to college and hoping her family would manage, he worked with social services and tribal support networks to ensure that assistance would be available for the Crowfeather family's ongoing needs. Mrs. Red Cloud, who had become something of an unofficial advocate for the family, helped coordinate a support network of neighbors and relatives who could step in when needed. The tribal health clinic received additional funding through Jack's foundation to provide better services for community members with chronic conditions like Winona's heart problems and Jake's asthma. What had started as emergency assistance for one family evolved into a broader community development initiative. Jack discovered that sustainable help required addressing systemic issues rather than individual crises. His foundation expanded to include job training programs, small business development loans, and educational support for other promising students. The transformation wasn't without challenges and setbacks. There were conflicts over priorities, misunderstandings about intentions, and resistance from some community members who remained suspicious of outside involvement in tribal affairs. Progress was slow, sometimes frustrating, and always complicated by the historical context of relations between white and Native American communities. But there were also victories that validated the approach. Other students began applying for college scholarships. Local businesses started offering internships and job opportunities for young people who had completed training programs. The suicide rate among teenagers began to decline as young people saw more reasons for hope in their futures. For Ayanna personally, the college experience was everything she had hoped and feared it would be. The academics were challenging but manageable for someone who had always excelled in school. The social isolation was more difficult, compounded by financial stress that persisted despite scholarship support and cultural differences that sometimes felt unbridgeable. She majored in social work with a minor in business administration, choices that reflected her commitment to returning home with skills that could make a practical difference. During summer breaks and holiday visits, she worked with Jack's foundation to evaluate programs and suggest improvements based on her growing understanding of both worlds. The relationship between Ayanna and Jack evolved from benefactor and recipient to colleagues working toward shared goals. Their different perspectives, his practical business experience and her lived understanding of poverty and cultural preservation, created a powerful combination for addressing complex social problems. Jack learned that effective philanthropy required listening more than talking, following rather than leading, and supporting existing community strengths rather than imposing outside solutions. Ayanna learned that allies could come from unexpected places and that building bridges between different worlds was possible when based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. By the time Ayanna graduated from college with honors, the foundation had grown into a regional model for community-based development. Other ranchers and business owners had joined as supporters, tribal colleges had formed partnerships with mainstream universities, and young people throughout the area had access to opportunities that hadn't existed a few years earlier. The ceremony marking Ayanna's graduation was held not at her university, but back on the reservation, in the community center where so many tribal gatherings had taken place over the years. Winona, now recovered and proud beyond words, offered a traditional blessing for her granddaughter's achievement. Jack sat in the audience next to Sarah and the boys, no longer an outsider but an adopted member of an extended family that had grown to include dozens of young people whose lives had been changed by what started as a simple act of kindness on a lonely highway. Ayanna's acceptance speech, delivered in both English and Lakota, talked about the power of unexpected encounters to change lives, the importance of maintaining cultural identity while embracing new opportunities, and the responsibility that comes with being lifted up by community support. she announced her intention to use her social work degree to establish a comprehensive support center for families in crisis, combining traditional healing practices with modern professional techniques. The young woman who had once sat by the creek dreaming impossible dreams had become living proof that with the right combination of determination, support, and opportunity, those dreams could become reality. This positivity. But perhaps more importantly, she had learned that true success meant using her achievements to create opportunities for others to follow similar paths. Jack Morrison, the cattleman who had stopped to help 3 stranded children on a highway, discovered that the life he saved that day was ultimately his own. His involvement with the Crow Feather family and the Pine Ridge community had given him purpose and meaning that pure profit never could. The foundation work had become his true legacy, more important than the ranch that had defined his identity for decades. The story that began with a desperate cry for help beside a lonely road had become a testament to the power of human connection to transcend boundaries of race, class, and culture. It proved that heroes come in many forms, and that sometimes the most profound rescues are mutual, with both the saved and the saver discovering strengths they never knew they possessed.